Um, if you guys have any questions throughout this webinar, please make sure that you put them in the Q&A box down at the bottom of your screen, and Kyle will be asking those kind of throughout the webinar, maybe even some at the end as well. But let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to go ahead and introduce everybody to Kyle if you don't know him already. He's the National Sales Manager over at HMR, and he's been managing the sales operation around the country for this organization for well over 15 years. And he currently oversees the daily operations and all of the business that is done in, I think it's believed, more than 39 states now. Is that right, Kyle?
Yeah, it's 42.
Fantastic. And he's been with HMR since 2012. He's been in the medical funding space for, again, like I mentioned, many years. And he has had the opportunity to fund several thousand cases with the primary concentration on funding TBI and catastrophic injury cases for plaintiffs who are uninsured. They do an amazing job over there at HMR, and we thoroughly enjoy offering these wonderful webinars for you guys. So Kyle, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to you, and let's get started.
All right, thanks so much. Yeah, we appreciate everybody tuning in today. This is actually, I think the second or third time that Randy and I have been able to team up on this, and it's just been such a great topic, and we had so much fantastic feedback. So when we had the opportunity to bring this to the audience at Connectionology, we really jumped at the chance. I got really interested in this just because of the injuries, I think, associated with these types of cases where people are poisoned, and kind of what they go through, what their families go through. And a lot of the feedback we got from the first webinars was, hey, if somebody has a case like this, what are the markers? What are the signs? What should I be looking for? And Randy has so much expertise in these cases, and did such a good job of explaining his process and how he works through this, that we were kind of asked to do it again. So with that, I'll take a second to introduce Randy. For those of you who don't know, Randy focuses his practice on the representation of victims of serious life-changing injuries. Those have been harmed by large corporations. Randy routinely is asked to speak to lawyers and doctors in order to educate them on such issues, particularly in the area of representing victims of traumatic brain injury. Randy is the immediate past chair of AAJ's Traumatic Brain Injury Litigation Group. And in 2016, Randy was honored to receive the Wisconsin Trial Lawyer of the Year award. He is an unbelievable lawyer and somebody that we at HMR have been fortunate enough to work with on some cases. So with that being said, I will be quiet and turn it over to you, Randy.
Thanks, Kyle. I just want to promote HMR. I think we're going to talk more at the end, so don't sign off until you learn a little bit more about how HMR can literally save you and your clients, because that's what happened with some of my cases during COVID. I have this 7 or 8 figure life care plan and they're not getting any of the treatment. Well, HMR looks into the cases and can decide what care to fund, and they've done just that, and it's worked out really well. So we'll talk more about HMR later, Kyle. All right. Let me share my screen.
And Randy, while you're getting that going, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you have questions as you're going, we really want this to be an interactive program, as we've done in the past. So if something comes up and you have a question about something, feel free to ask on the spot, and we'll try to get to the questions as Randy's presenting.
Yeah, and please, Kyle, just interrupt me anytime with questions, because it can get fairly in depth. So I'm going to start by introducing the concept of CO and talk about the science behind it, because it is important in handling these cases, and you'll understand why when we get through it. And then I'll talk about target defendants and damages, and feel free to interrupt with questions. So carbon monoxide is referred to as the silent killer. It can't be seen, can't be smelled, it can't be heard, but it can be prevented with CO detectors, typically. I'll get more into depth about CO detectors as we go through this, but generally CO detectors in the United States are designed to save people's lives. They're not necessarily designed to prevent other injuries from CO, but they are designed to save people's lives, and they do. Despite that, the CDC estimates that about 50,000 people are treated in the hospital setting for acute carbon monoxide poisoning, accidental, I should say, because there can be intentional, but with the advent of catalytic converters on automobiles, it's a lot less likely that you can actually kill yourself by inhaling car exhaust fume. CDC also tracks deaths from accidental carbon monoxide, and it's over 400 per year. And every time you hear about a natural disaster like a hurricane or the wildfires out west, you hear about sometimes up to dozens of people being poisoned by carbon monoxide. And a lot of those are generators without detectors, or generators that are too close to homes without detectors. So let's talk about the science behind this. So carbon monoxide is the product of incomplete combustion from some type of fuel source. Could be coal, gasoline, kerosene, natural gas, oil, propane, even tobacco or wood. But typically in a carbon monoxide personal injury case, you're going to have some type of natural gas or possibly kerosene or oil or propane as the fuel source. And I'll get into what incomplete combustion is. So on the left, we have a stove burning a blue flame. That's complete combustion, or at least as close to complete combustion as we can obtain with our stove. On the right, you see what is incomplete combustion. So what happens is in this particular instance, there could be food sources that are causing the incomplete combustion, but the flame is not getting the fuel source that it is designed to burn. And as a result, it will produce carbon monoxide. So what is carbon monoxide? It's a carbon atom and an oxygen atom combined to form a molecule. What is the difference between carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide? As an attorney handling carbon monoxide cases, I can tell you that the biggest pet peeve is reading medical records or having a doctor say CO2 poisoning. There's rarely a situation where there could be CO2 poisoning. So carbon monoxide has one oxygen molecule, carbon dioxide has two. That's the only difference between the two molecules. However, combustion of any type, breathing or decay of organic matter, causes the production of carbon dioxide. Carbon monoxide is only produced when there is little oxygen available to the food source or the fuel source and the flame. Look at the lighter versus heavier. Carbon dioxide with that extra oxygen molecule is 55% heavier than air, whereas carbon monoxide is 2% lighter than air. Carbon dioxide is not flammable. Carbon monoxide is flammable. You can smell carbon dioxide at high traces, but carbon monoxide cannot be detected by smell or taste. And carbon dioxide is only dangerous to humans when it replaces almost all of the oxygen, and that rarely happens. Carbon monoxide is toxic to almost all life forms at over 50 parts per million. And we'll get into what 50 parts per million means, but essentially it is the concentration level of carbon monoxide to oxygen in the air. All right, so how does carbon monoxide affect humans? We have red blood cells in our body that carry oxygen molecules from our lungs to different body organs and tissues. And normally we have an oxygen atom and another oxygen atom combine to form the O2 molecule. And that's what's transported from our lungs to our different bodily organs and tissues. So oxygen enters a red blood cell and it binds with something called hemoglobin. Now, keep in mind, I know I'm going into a little bit of detail that may make not a lot of sense right now, but it will when we get to the science later on that you're going to need to know to handle these cases. So within the oxygen blood cells, we have what are called hemoglobins, which is essentially a protein molecule. The oxygen binds to that protein molecule, the different O2 molecules bind, and then as the red blood cells distribute to the different organs and tissues within the body, the oxygen is released from the hemoglobin. And we see a bunch of hemoglobins here in the middle. And what really happens is each red blood cell has 250 million hemoglobins in just one red blood cell. And that'll be important later on as well. Okay, so we have one hemoglobin combined with, say, 4 O2 molecules, and then remember, 250 million hemoglobins within one red blood cell. That red blood cell then goes distributing these different oxygen or O2 molecules to our tissues and organs. And this is what it looks like. We have oxygen leaving the lung, combining to that hemoglobin in the red blood cell, distributed to the organs, and then the organs give off carbon dioxide, which is carried by the red blood cells back to the lungs. And there it's converted back to oxygen, and the cycle continues with normal oxygenation. What happens with carbon monoxide poisoning is that those CO molecules combine to the hemoglobin to form what is called carboxyhemoglobin. All right, so imagine 250 hemoglobin molecules in a red blood cell, and then CO enters that space and combines with all those hemoglobins. For some reason, carbon monoxide molecules are 204 times more likely to bind with hemoglobin than oxygen molecules. So there's something about the makeup of the hemoglobin that has an affinity for carbon monoxide as opposed to oxygen. And what happens to the body when it's exposed to high levels of carbon monoxide is there are two different mechanisms of injury. The initial event at the acute poisoning stage is called hypoxia, which is essentially a lack of oxygen to the body tissues, organs, brain. Okay, that's one event, the hypoxia, the starvation of oxygen to a body part of or brain or tissue even. The second part is an inflammatory process that happens and is well described in the literature following carbon monoxide. That takes place over the next days, weeks, and possibly even months. So here we have what happens in a typical carbon monoxide poisoning event. The hemoglobin contains iron atoms. And now the CO molecules attached to the hemoglobin, but the O2 molecules, if there are any, if there's not a complete starvation of O2, which is typical, there's usually not. However, those O2 molecules, for some reason, are locked into place with those iron molecules. And so when that hemoglobin, it gets carried to the body tissues and organs and brain with the red blood cells tend to release just the CO molecules, but not the O2 molecules, making that hypoxic event even more dangerous and life-threatening and damaging.
Randy, have they seen like a correlation between the hypoxic event right there and you have this deprivation of oxygen? Have they shown any kind of correlation that, hey, your lungs are more severely affected in the event, or your brain, or is it kind of an overall failure depending on exposure of several areas of the body that suffer from oxygen deprivation?
Well, remember that the red blood cells are distributed throughout our body, and that's the carrier of the CO. So CO does not discriminate what body part it's going to damage. Now, there is more blood flow through the heart and the brain. So those are the two areas typically most affected, but there can be damage throughout the body.
Gotcha.
I'm going to focus primarily on brain damage, but another big issue is heart damage. But there also are a constellation of symptoms possible as a result of the CO event, just because it's carried by blood. So your red blood cells are all over your body. The second mechanism of injury is that inflammatory process. And like I said, that can go on for up to a month even, maybe longer, but it really mimics what goes on in a traumatic brain injury case following the actual event of the injury. And what we have is, we have the apoptosis and the excitotoxicity, which results in a damage, for example, to a brain cell. But that brain cell, that single brain cell, then releases dangerous chemicals, and there's a reaction that can cause damage to accompanying brain cells. It's not just the single event, it's an inflammatory process, very similar to the TBI process. So what are we looking for acutely? And I'm assuming when I say acutely, I'm talking about an acute single event carbon monoxide poisoning. There can be chronic low-level poisonings too, and I'll talk about that when I talk about detectors. But what we're looking for acutely in a single event is headache, confusion, fatigue, possibly even seizures, dizziness, loss of consciousness, and nausea. I've had several clients lose consciousness and wake up with their pet licking their face with no CO detectors on the property. Okay, so what we're looking at here, and this is where I talk about the carbon monoxide detectors and the flaw with them. So typically we'll have some low level of carbon monoxide in our home in that 0 to 9 parts per million. Remember, I talked about parts per million. That's just those parts of carbon monoxide molecules in the air. 15 parts per million, you first show symptoms. 35 parts per million, drowsiness, headache, slight increase in respiratory rate and dizziness. And then 70 parts per million, first readout of UL 2034 alarms, which is the standard carbon monoxide detector alarm that is sold in any of your stores. That is the standard alarm. And those are regulated. The levels at which it reads out is regulated. And those regulations require that, and when I say require, they actually require this because they were afraid when they set these standards that too many people, if they set it any lower, would just take the batteries out or ignore the alarm and not do anything about it. So the 70 parts per million, it will not alarm until it has remained at 70 parts per million for 60 to 240 minutes. So 1 to 4 hours before that alarm is allowed to go off. It's not allowed to go off any less than that. So like I said, it's designed to save people's lives, but it's not designed to prevent permanent long-term health effects. That being said, there are sensitive alarms that will show you. Now, remember, they're not UL 2034 compliant because they can't be, but they are more sensitive, and they are going to tell you any level of CO. So buy those for your friends and your family members at Christmas time. Okay, so now here's what we're looking for in the acute medical treatment records. The fire department, and let me take a step back. There are 2 different levels of carbon monoxide that make a good case. All right, ambient air readings and carboxyhemoglobin levels. So in the fire department or EMT records, they are the ones that carry the meter that can give them an ambient air reading, the level of carbon monoxide in the air that's breathable. So a lot of times their meters may max out at a certain level, and the level, like for example, I have a case where they entered the property and their meters immediately within one step of going in the door pegged out at 500 parts per million. So what do we know about that? We know that the readings were probably a lot higher than that. It would be the odds of their meters tapping out at 500 and there only being 500 parts per million are astronomically low. So the levels in that home were probably quite higher than 500 parts per million. Now they had their oxygen equipment on, so they weren't being poisoned, but my clients were already at the emergency room by the time they got there. Okay, so the ambulance or the EMT workers also typically carry a pulse oximeter. And that's just, I'm sorry, did you say something?
No.
Oh, okay. So pulse ox is just something that's the thing that goes on your finger to give you oxygen level. And they also have them that will give you carbon monoxide levels. However, I warn you, don't center a case on a pulse ox reader unless it's extremely high, because they're not very accurate when it comes to CO. And I'll explain a little bit about that as we go. All right, you also want to look at whether or not your client was put on non-rebreather high flow oxygen in the ambulance or at the scene. It makes a big difference later on when I talk about carboxyhemoglobin level. So you need to know the duration, if they're on a non-rebreather, how long they were on that. I'll explain why in a little bit. Okay, then you want to know if when they're brought to the emergency room or acute care center, whether they're put on hyperbaric oxygen, and if so, how long. That is the gold standard when it comes to treatment of carbon monoxide poisoning with an accompanying neurological complaint. So, and I've seen different care providers do this differently. Some will consider headache a complaint. Headache is the most common symptom while you're being poisoned by carbon monoxide. Some will treat that as a neurological complaint and order the hyperbaric. I wish more would, because it improves outcome. Some will require passing out, losing consciousness, before that's considered a neurological symptom, before they'll treat the person with hyperbaric. And then finally, the gold standard for the carbon monoxide level in the human body is the blood test. And believe it or not, our blood tests are sensitive enough to figure out, remember, each red blood cell has 250 million hemoglobins, but our tests are sensitive enough to figure out the carboxyhemoglobin level in the blood. And that can't be fought. It's a gold standard. It all depends upon how much time has elapsed and what treatment was provided, however, to figure out the peak carboxyhemoglobin level in the blood. Remember, 250 million of these in one red blood cell. And we're able to test for that. Pretty amazing.
Hey, Randy, let me ask you something. So, you know, if somebody has a case where somebody's been poisoned by carbon monoxide, the fire department walks in there, they do an ambient air reading. Is it typical that, you know, let's just say somebody's lost consciousness at that point, an EMS is called, you know, all of those tests that you're talking about, that is the standard for what should take place. They should be carrying these meters to do ambient air readings. They should do a blood draw on your, you know, on a patient suspected of poison. All of those things should be happening.
All of those things should be happening if they detect CO at a significant level on the property. By significant, I mean higher than what should be allowed to set off your alarm. So more than 70 parts per million.
Are there ever instances where, say, you know, they get an ambient air reading from the fire department, but, you know, they get them in the hospital and they don't do a blood draw, you know, and now you don't know, do you still have a case that something like that happens?
Well, I've learned this the hard way. My only under 7-figure settlement was a case where I didn't have ambient air readings and I didn't have carboxyhemoglobin levels. Now I had enough, and I should say the third prong of a great CO case is abnormal neuroimaging, which I did have in that case. So just because there's no ambient air or carboxyhemoglobin readings doesn't mean you can't develop a case. You actually can. And it's not uncommon for them not to take an ambient air reading if they don't have the meters with them. or some smaller fire departments will only have one, even though they have 2 ambulances and it's going to a different location. So there may not be an ambient air reading. And remember, if you don't have an ambient air reading, but you have a carboxyhemoglobin blood test, you're fine.
Right.
And so if you don't have either, I probably wouldn't take that case now. I would have early on in my career, but I know better. I may still take it though if I get imaging done and it confirms changes consistent with CO. And obviously my client has to be symptomatic, which is a given. We wouldn't take the case if they weren't, right?
Got it. Thank
Okay,
you.
so yeah, sure. Here are the different carboxyhemoglobin levels as far as signs and symptoms. And most of my cases are in the 20 to 50 range. Any more than 50 and your client's likely going to be dead, depending on how long they've been in the space where the carbon monoxide was. Now, here's something important to keep in mind, and that is carboxyhemoglobin's half-life in the bloodstream. So if you're breathing room air for 4 to 6 hours, carboxyhemoglobin levels will drop in half. That's what half-life means. So if you go from if you have a 40 carboxyhemoglobin level, after 4 to 6 hours, it's going to be a 20. And so on until it gets down to 0. If you're treated with that rebreather I was mentioning that a lot of EMTs will use, that half-life drops down to 80 to 90 minutes. And on hyperbaric oxygen, it's only 20 to 30 minutes, which shows you how invaluable hyperbaric treatment is to get the carboxyhemoglobins out of the bloodstream. It's a profound difference from 4 to 6 hours to 20 to 30 minutes each half-life. But remember that when you're looking at those medical records and there's a blood draw, it'll have the time, but what you have to do is look at what treatment was given between the time they were rescued from the event to the time the blood was drawn and what treatment was provided, because you can roughly calculate the carboxyhemoglobin maximum levels yourself by knowing how to calculate that half-life. Now, here's an example of a case I have where the pulse ox was given, and here's what you're looking for. So rescue 2 found carbon monoxide levels above 500 parts per million throughout the residence. Actually, once we deposed the EMT, we found out that no, throughout the residence isn't actually accurate. It was as soon as they walked in the residence, because they started opening windows. So it had to have been higher than 500 parts per million. And the EMT crew, whoever wrote this report, never bothered to put, well, that's actually where their meters peg out, where they tap out. That's the maximum reading they could have gotten. They don't imply that it was much higher than that, which we know it had to have been. So again, you wouldn't know that till you get into discovery and figure out where their meters peg out. Now, here's what I warned you about as far as the pulse ox reading. Okay, so this is a EMT record. CO monitor was alarming upon entry. Well, by CO monitor, they meant the one that they carry with them, not a home one. Registered 500 parts per million. Of course it did, it pegged out at its max. Then they rescue, oh, by the way, skin change, this says skin pale. That's also an acute symptom of CO poisoning. This little girl was unconscious. Her dad was awoken by their dog, who unfortunately died weeks after this, probably from the CO. So they found a pulse ox reading of 49%. That's what that RAD 57 refers to, is a manufacturer of the pulse ox machine. Now, she was placed on that non-rebreather oxygen. So in calculating her peak carboxyhemoglobin level, it's important to know that. And that's what a pulse ox looks like. Now, they did another pulse ox when they got to the emergency department, and it came down to 33. Okay, but remember, that's the inaccurate pulse ox reading. When I actually looked to the blood work, we see that she was actually at a 38.9, and this is the accurate test. This is the blood test. This doesn't lie. The CO level had her down to 33. Well, no, she was actually still at a 38.9 when blood was drawn after that pulse ox. There's no way her carboxyhemoglobin level could have gone up between the pulse ox and the blood draw. So it was inaccurate. And we have to use, if we have the data, we want to use the accurate data to calculate peak carboxyhemoglobin level by going backwards in time. We don't want to rely on the pulse ox. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that although the level of ambient air is important to your case, and the carboxyhemoglobin level is really essential to your case as well, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily correlated to ongoing problems, which is odd. You'd think it would be. You'd think the higher the level, since high levels can kill you, you'd think the higher the level, the more correlation there would be between that level and long-term symptoms from the poisoning. There's not. They thought there was early on, like this 1923 government publication implied that there was, but we know from study after study after study that there's actually not a correlation. And this is important because approximately 50% of people that are poisoned develop the neurologic, neurobehavioral, or cognitive sequelae. So 50% of people that are poisoned every year, I think I said earlier, the CD said, let me look at my notes, said there was about 50,000 people reporting to the hospital each year from acute CO poisoning. Well, that means half of them, 25,000, are going to have ongoing neurological, neurobehavioral, or cognitive problems. This doesn't even mention the physical problems like heart issues that a person may have. You want to jump in, Kyle?
Yeah, I was just, I was thinking, you talked about, there are certain treatments that are given, to improve a person's condition, after the time of the event. And you're talking about almost, going back and calculating what their levels actually were at the time of the event. And I imagine that becomes a very important person, whoever that is, expert wise, when it comes to actually proving a case and, maybe combating a certain attack that you might be getting on a case.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. These cases are very expert driven. You can't go to your local doctor and find someone knowledgeable about carboxyhemoglobin levels and carbon monoxide poisoning and has the knowledge to calculate, to go back in time and create the peak carboxyhemoglobin level. Ironically, I actually have a case where a nurse tried to do that, a treating nurse, which why can't I get a doctor to take interest in science, but I can find a nurse to do it. And she actually tried to do that, and she wasn't that far off. She got it close enough, at least. But yeah, you're right. You have to find someone knowledgeable. It has to be an expert in the field. You can't rely on treaters on these cases. In fact, I get very little out of treaters in these cases. And that's one of the ways HMR helped me. I don't need to rely on treaters. We can find the experts in the industry and fund it that way. And they can get the treatment that's going to help them, or at least help them somewhat. I mean, one of the girls I used, she was struggling so bad, and the treatment center that we were able to get her into really taught her some techniques to improve her activities of life. And she's only 20 now, I think. So this is going to pay off, for her years to come. All right, so 50% develop those ongoing problems. Remember, I talked about the inflammatory process that's going to go on, that may go on beyond the time that you first meet with your client. It could still be going on if you sign them up very early. So what you're looking for to ask your potential new clients, obviously the source of the exposure or the cause is very important in every case. And like Kyle had asked before, if you don't have ambient air readings and you don't have carboxyhemoglobin levels, we've worked on cases where we actually don't have either of those, but we have the source. And we were able to do modeling and figure out the ambient air readings, which in turn gave us the carboxyhemoglobin levels. Now, before I do that, I would screen for brain damage because I wouldn't want to spend 6 figures on a long shot like that. Because it was a long shot, but it paid off. Okay, so ambient air readings, we know about that now. We're looking for that in the EMT records Occasionally it will make it into the ER records, but rarely. Acute neurological symptoms, that the headache, the passing out, the dizziness, could be heart issues. Even I had a heart attack at the scene. That was another dog saving life case with no CO detectors. The acute treatment, and again, the importance of the non-rebreather, high flow oxygen, hyperbaric oxygen when it comes to calculating the peak carboxyhemoglobin level if you have the blood test. All right, now I'd like to move on to our target defendants. And it's basically any owner or servicer of fuel burning appliances. Hotel cases are frequent, are common. And it's typically a lack of CO detectors, number one. Our state actually has a statute now requiring them, but many states do not. It's a lack of maintenance on whatever the fuel burning source was. For some reason, pool heaters are very common. And I think the reason they're so commonly causing the CO poisoning is because the owners think they just have to install them and that's it. They realize with their boilers, for example, if it's a hot water boiler, heat and water, they realize that they have to have those serviced on a regular basis. And the installation manual for the particular boiler will say that you have to have this serviced annually, or they'll have a contract with an HVAC expert or crew that come in so often and service all their fuel burning appliances, but for some reason they don't typically routinely service the pool heater. So those cases are common. Unfortunately, school poisoning cases are very common. Again, it's a lack of CO detector and it's usually negligent maintenance. Could be negligent installation as well, same as the hotel. That could be. I have a very unfortunate statute of repose of 7 years, so I don't typically see those negligent installation cases. It's usually maintenance. Office buildings are common. Apartment buildings or hotels, even residential homes. And typically, again, it's maintenance and lack of CO detectors. So that's going to be a state-by-state case where you're going to have to research your own state to determine whether or not they have a CO detector requirement.
Hey, Randy, I'm curious on cases where it's, an issue in the home, does some of the responsibility fall obviously on the homeowner to maintain? Do they ever make the argument, well, hey, there's some comparative fault here because the homeowner or user error or something of that nature when it comes to cases in the home?
Yeah, typically what I see in my residential cases is I have the homeowner, if it's not my client, sometimes it is, negligently maintaining a furnace, for example, because any manual that comes with a furnace says annual safety inspections are required. Or I've had some manuals that say, or the threat of carbon monoxide is increased. Well, there you go, you're on notice as a homeowner that you should be getting these annually inspected. And then also lack of CO detectors on the homeowner. But a lot of times what I see is that, at least in my cases, and I don't have a ton of them, but I do have quite a number, the homeowner actually had some type of an agreement with an HVAC company or had the HVAC company in there prior during the same heating season. So they obviously did something to get it running, but never checked, and I'm going to get to that, about the output of CO in the flame that was being produced.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so yeah, we have a hot water, we have a typical gas furnace, hot water boiler, water heater. Boat cases are very common. There can be backdraft or houseboats that have fuel burning appliances. Backdraft happens when you're going at certain speeds, and typically a boat will be designed to take this into account, but there may be post-manufacture changes to the boat that create the front of the boat to rise up higher than it should, and the CO to backdraft into where the people may be. So this phenomena is these keyless cars. Many cars are keyless now, and people get home and don't realize that they left them on and left them running. And what happens is, like I said earlier, catalytic converters have saved countless lives because cars do not emit those dangerous levels of CO anymore. However, as the space that they're in the case I'm thinking of, it was a garage, the exhaust recirculated into the garage. It didn't have anywhere to go. So that is what created the engine to burn erratically. It typically would not have burned like that. It was creating that incomplete combustion because the exhaust kept going to the intake. And as that cycle continued, it did not take long for there to be dangerous levels of carbon monoxide that eventually leaked into the home. Honda, not specific to Honda, but generator manufacturers have known for years that they kill people during these tragedies that I mentioned earlier, like hurricanes and bad storms and wildfires. And for the high-end generators that rich people can afford, they put CO detectors on. For your average consumer that can't afford the high-end generator, they don't have any type of mechanism to prevent it from operating, despite there being high levels of carbon monoxide in the air. Now, oftentimes with a generator case, you're going to find operator error. They put it too close to the living space or even within the living space. So that may outweigh a case against a manufacturer because of the high negligence on your particular client. It's very fact specific. For some reason, these gas-powered forklifts give off a lot of carbon monoxide. And I think that comes down to maintenance as well as, because typically they're maintained by an outside company. So it's not a workers' comp case. It would be a maintenance case against the outside company. But then also you have to look at the negligence that's going to be attributed to the employer, because probably they're operating the forklifts in an enclosed space without proper ventilation. Kyle?
Yeah, I'm just curious, going back to the keyless cars, because I can't remember the last time I was in a car that I actually put a key in the ignition. And I'm just curious, if you have a scenario like that, like the garage incident you just explained, does that become a user error type thing? And are those viable cases if somebody's like, well, you should have turned the car off when you parked in the garage right there,
Yeah, well, obviously whoever parked that vehicle is going to have a lot of fault, right? But the car industry also knows about this, and what they've done on newer models is they have an alarm that beeps if you leave the car running with that key fob in your pocket and exit the vehicle. And it's as simple as that. And in the case I'm thinking of, there were other members of the family that were poisoned as well that didn't have anything to do with parking the car.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have that issue like the owner would,
Gotcha.
or whoever parked it.
Okay.
All right. Now I want to talk about liability, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through a case, and this is the case that I did not have ambient air, and I did not have carboxyhemoglobin, and it settled close to 7 figures despite that because of the neuroimaging. Okay, this lady owned a flower shop in a strip mall. There were 10 different units, and right here you can see this box up on a roof, and that is the heating and air conditioning unit. And each unit in this mall had their own separate HVAC system, which is kind of unique. The owner of the property did not provide CO detectors. Now, technically under our law, it wasn't required at the time, but our standard of care expert said, yeah, you should provide your tenants with a CO detector that plugs in so nothing can go wrong, because you're responsible for giving them a safe environment because they're paying you to do that. This case involved the owner of the property, but also an HVAC company. that provide maintenance to those 10 units on the roof. All right, here's a close-up of it. And here we have a typical HVAC rooftop unit. So most residential is air conditioning separate from the heating. In these commercial rooftop units, the air conditioning also, this is the air conditioning over here, it operates, and also the heat can operate from the same unit. So what happens is we have gas coming up to the roof. We have 4 burners here. Those burners ignite and heat this, and then the exhaust comes out of the unit up here, and it's released safely into the atmosphere. This fan actually sits right over these tubes. These tubes that make up what's called the heat exchanger, and the fan blows the hot air down across these tubes into her space that she's renting. And this is the normal production of heat in a unit like this. Here you have the flame, it heats it up and exhausts it here. The fan sits right over here and pushes the air down, the warm air. And it's pushed down into the space she's renting. Here we have a compromised heat exchanger. And what happens is that air that's being heated, and in this case, it contained high levels of CO, it's pushed right here through the heat exchanger and then blown down into her space. And so what happens is the carbon monoxide is taken through the ductwork to directly where she spends most of her day. And she was spending 18 hours a day in her shop that winter. She was trying to get a new business started. So interestingly, it was our allegation that it wasn't a low-level chronic poisoning. It was actually a high-level chronic poisoning where she was being poisoned, what we would call acutely, day after day after day during that heating season. One of her employees had quit that winter because every time she went to work for her, she got sick and had a headache, and other family members got sick. So my case against the HVAC company, the case against the landlord was pretty simple. No CO detectors, and he didn't provide the recommended maintenance that he should have for those rooftop HVAC units. We have different standards and codes, ANSI or ASHRAE, for maintenance of commercial buildings. There's also a code for maintenance of residential buildings, and they differ a little. But there are codes that you can apply. You can have an expert say these codes provide the minimum standard of care, which is what they say right in the manual, the minimum standard of care. You're certainly allowed to go beyond what the minimum is, but this is the minimum, and don't fall below it. So what you do is you look for what the standards are for those rooftop HVAC air systems. And here we have, this is an outdoor, any type of outdoor heat exchanging system. You're supposed to check for proper operation of the heat exchanger and clean it, make sure it's operating safely semi-annually every 6 months. Well, that wasn't being done. So that provides fault against the building owner because he wasn't complying with this. However, he had contracted with an HVAC company and they were not complying with this. Okay, this applies specifically here to rooftop units. Check the heat exchanger for damage or evidence of leaks. Clean, restore, replace as required semi-annually every 6 months. And then do a combustion test. Remember, I showed you where those burners were, and what you do is you test the combustion right at those burners. And oftentimes over the years, that has to be adjusted or it's going to give off high levels of CO. That wasn't done in this case because the HVAC company didn't provide their technicians with these combustion testers. And this is all it is. It goes right into the exhaust and it gives you a readout. You can see this is 12 parts per million. It was our allegation that had they done that, they would have gotten high levels readings, and then they would have replaced the heat exchanger. They came in, I want to say July, after the heating season, after she had been poisoned, and did their annual maintenance that they failed to do the year before, and found that the combustion or the heat exchanger was, what he told my client was cracked in half. Cracked in half. What he told me in his deposition was tiny, minute hole. But anyway, all right, now let's move on to damages. And that was just an example of a typical case. You know, the facts will dictate your case, how you develop liability. But there are standards that apply to HVAC companies, homeowners and business owners, hotels. By the way, the hotel industry has known for years that they're killing and causing brain damage to people. And they have for, I want to say 40 years that they've tracked this. So that's another potential case against a hotel, is the fact that they're on notice and they failed to, at least in some brands have changed their brand standards to require installation of CO detectors. Others have not. Kyle, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just curious if there are any like habitual offenders that you see. I know you said hotels. Is it your, you know, larger chains or more of your mom and pop? And I guess I was curious, you know, you were talking about notice being such a big issue, you know, and them having noticed that there's, you know, something going on. I'd imagine 9 times out of 10, they're pointing the finger at the maintenance company saying, you know, hey, it was on them to make sure that they came in here and maintained everything properly.
Well, the cases against the mom and pops, they typically have $1 million or less of insurance. So I don't think those cases, you know, those cases would just settle if you were to know one of the damages, one of the persons that were damaged. Now the cases against the large chains, believe it or not, some of the better large chains they haven't developed those brand standards. I was shocked when I learned which hotels had the brand standards and which ones didn't. And I found it hard to believe. Now a lot of the brands, even the good brands, have their high-end hotels, but then they have everything along the way down to very low-end hotels. And they just didn't develop any brand standards regarding CO detectors. They left it up to the franchisee because these are set up as franchises. So the franchisor always argues that we don't have any control. It's all up to them. Well, you require them to wear your uniform. You require them to do all these different things, but yet you can't just tell them to provide safety for their guests by getting a CO detector in each room. Give me a break.
Right. Well, and the, you know, you had touched on in the beginning, you know, some of the, you know, acute medical illnesses that happen, whether it's, you know, headaches or nausea or vomiting or loss of consciousness or, you know, things of that nature. You know, I don't, and maybe you're going to get into it, but, you know, how long lasting are some of the symptoms versus others? You know, hey, maybe the headaches subside, but you've got, you know, cognitive damage to the brain that could be lifelong, you know?
Yeah, what I'm going to do is show the imaging, and based upon the imaging, I guess I thought it was implied, but I didn't specifically state this early on, and I should have, because it happens in our TBI cases where sometimes our client, they think they're getting worse over time instead of better. Well, with CO cases, there's something, and it's not disputable, the delayed neurological deficits. And it's very well published. It happens. And so the majority of my cases, I have brain injury related findings, concentration, memory, you know, and behavioral. Behavioral is a big one. The emotional behavioral effect. Obviously they feel victimized. They may have PTSD depending on how severe the event was, but they feel really vulnerable and helpless because they were almost killed because from something that they can't even see, taste, or smell. You know, it's a really weird feeling to have to go through that, and some of them deal with it better than others. But the long-term problems I have are brain injury, brain damage related, or heart related. Now I do have some cases where I have various symptoms that I know they're related, because I have 3 cases that have lost teeth shortly after the incident. And it makes sense because the CO could have killed the nerve that is feeding blood to the tooth. And it could have been, you know, attacking the tooth essentially. But I'm not going to try and relate that. I mean, the dental bills are hundreds of dollars on something that isn't well published in the literature. But the brain damage alone, I mean, that's where you're getting the 7 to 8 figure life care plan.
Sure. No, I understand.
And so now I'll show you what you're looking for as far as the development of brain damage proof. And I do this in every TBI case as well, but I start with the neuroradiology, look to the vestibular symptom. Sleep is big in TBI and brain damage from CO, sleep issues. And then I use neurooptometry. In my state, I'm allowed to use a neurooptometrist who is not an MD, and he or she can give opinions on cause and permanency and diagnoses. Other states, you're gonna have to find a neuroophthalmologist who actually has a medical license. It just depends on your case law. And then auditory processing, speech language pathology is big. And then finally neuropsychology, which for a while in my TBI cases, I wasn't using neuropsychology. I'm not a big proponent of it, but I found a good one and I'm finding deficits. And when you put all these together, I'll conclude at the end, there's really no dispute about cause. What was going on in this person's life that could have caused all these different problems at the time? One thing, they were poisoned. Okay, so let's look at some of the neuroimaging findings that you're looking for. And actually, I had mentioned earlier about development of cases where you don't have ambient air and you don't have carboxyhemoglobin levels. You can still look to the neuroimaging and then try it. If you have the fuel burning appliance, you can have an engineer recreate what was going on if it hasn't been destroyed. Spoliation letter is very important, by the way. Get that out as soon as you get the case or sooner. I've drafted ones for potential clients on their behalf. All right, so neuroimaging, there are 5 common abnormalities that you're looking for. So the globus pallidus is an area within the deep brain that is very susceptible, according to the literature, to the development of ischemic lesions or atrophy. It may shrink. So if it's atrophy that you're looking for, you typically have one-sided atrophy. And then number 2, diffuse white matter ischemic changes, focal white matter ischemic changes. I'm going to show you all these, by the way. Dilated paravascular spaces and hippocampal atrophy or asymmetry. Just like the globus pallidus, there may be atrophy, or it may be that the 2 sides are asymmetric because there's one on each side. Okay, so this is a blow up of globus pallidus ischemic lesions. I don't know how well you can see this, but there's a lesion right here and a lesion right here that should not be there. That's a resolution isn't great, but I think you can see the outline of this shape right here. That's the lesion. And your neuroradiologist, when testifying, can play around with the imaging. There's a thing called windowing that all neuroradiologists use to change the contrast so that this would really pop out. And here we have those globus pallidus ischemic changes compared with the literature. Right here's the lesion. You see 2 lesions, one on each side. And right here is an obvious lesion from the CO literature. All right, so here we have, this is actually the flower shop lady. Here we have the white matter diffuse ischemic changes. And what you're looking at is this, these white tracks. Same, it's lighter than it should be, and then you'll compare it to the literature. Well, obviously that is very visible. That can't be disputed. Again, these are diffuse. And that actually makes sense because she didn't have that single acute event. She was poisoned throughout that heating season. Again, so now this is compared to the normal. Clearly it's lighter than it should be. Not quite as visible, but you'll see that it should be dark. So obviously it's lighter than it should be. And there is the literature. Just better imaging quality, I would guess, in the literature. This was a clinical scan, not a advanced neuroimaging. So it may not even have been a 3T, I don't remember. But again, the literature makes it pretty clear that these white areas should not be there. Now, what may happen more often in acute single poisoning episodes is that you just have a focal white matter ischemic lesion. That's what you're looking at here. And here are two of them. Poor quality one, but nevertheless, it's there. And then comparing that to the literature. By the way, I should mention, in my cases at least, the defense bar has not yet caught up on CO case defense. So a lot of them have on TBI cases, or at least they think they have. But when it comes to defending carbon monoxide cases, they're not there yet. They don't know the literature. They don't know the experts in the field. If they do, they're not hiring them. They're hiring quacks. And the quacks don't know the literature. So right now, these cases are really going well.
Well, and Randy, I imagine that when you're referencing kind of the literature, you know, that the person who carries the day in this is going to be a neuroradiologist who's able to really point out, hey, this is what you're looking at, this is what the literature says, et cetera. And they're really, you know, kind of making the day for you.
Well, I would say that the neuroradiologist is just one component of it, because the neuroradiologist will say these changes are consistent with CO, and here's the literature to prove it, and here's the MRI. You can't dispute that that's there. It's there on 3 different modalities. It's not artifact. It shouldn't be there, and it is. But then the medical practitioner is the one that's going to have to clinically correlate that and say, you know, I've done the history, I've examined the patient, I've looked at the imaging, and I'm saying that this is clinically correlated, that the imaging changes are due to the CO event.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So it's a team approach.
Hey, so here, real quick, I want you to remember where your place is. I think Ginger's going to interrupt us, and we're going to have one of our sponsors, you know, come in and tell us a little bit about what they do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kyle. And Randy, this is very informative. I tell you, I'm learning so many things today that I didn't know before. So thank you so much for bringing this education to everybody.
Hey, Ginger, let me thank you and John for the whole connectionology. It's really saved my mental health during this global pandemic.
It's our pleasure. And I think we're somewhere around 140 webinars now already since last year. So it's pretty incredible. Different topics, different, you know, speakers. Yeah. If anyone's watching who wants to speak, please contact me, okay? Because we're going to keep going with these. Even though we've started our live seminars again, we're actually right now preparing for a New York City program in March, a national program in May. Even though we're working on those, we're going to continue with these webinars for everybody because we've had really good feedback. So we appreciate everything you're doing, Randy, and thank you so much, Kyle.
You bet.
But now it's my pleasure to introduce all of you to Kim with OnPoint. As many of you guys know, they do an incredible job over there. John Romano loves working with them as well. And it is such an honor to have Kim with us. She's going to tell you a little bit more about what they specialize in. So thanks for being with us today, Kim.
Great. Thanks, Ginger. It's a pleasure to be here, and we're always so thankful for this opportunity. Just to tell you a little bit about us, OnPoint is a legal nurse consulting and expert witness firm, and we've been supporting attorneys for over 25 years on any cases involving illness and injury. And basically, we have 5 programs to help you. We all know how time-consuming getting the records that you need can be, and we have a team of retrieval specialists who can help you get those records. And we also have nurses that can index them for you, making it much easier for you to locate what you need in the record. Also, if you find that you're getting bogged down with complex cases, or maybe your paralegal needs some help, or maybe you haven't tried using nurses in the past, The nurses in our consulting program have a lot of experience helping attorneys. They make the complex information simple. And they do this through timelines and chronologies that include our unique case analysis, which outlines strengths and weaknesses, as well as identifies missing records, systems failures, red flags, and possible defense strategies. They also identify the impact of pre-existing conditions and can differentiate between new versus aggravated injuries. Our nursing home and long-term care program can assist with anything long-term care related, from simple thumbs up, thumbs down merit screens to specialized experts who are familiar with those standards of care. Our program coordinator is a clinical geriatric specialist herself with over 30 years in the industry. Our expert witness program provides experts in any specialty needed who are located nationwide and all clinically active, and there's no cost or no risk to you for us to search for the right expert. For damages, we excel at quantifying damages with our life care plans and our medical cost projections, which are a lower cost option. For non-economic damages, our pain and suffering analysis really helps to tell the client's story. I think you touched on this a little bit. It quantifies what the client experiences: loss of freedom, loss of mobility. We pull that information out of the records for you to expand upon. So I know records are all electronic these days, but if this still feels familiar to you, we can help. Our goal is to make sure you're not blindsided, to avoid surprises, and simplify the medicine. We're accessible, easy to work with. You can email me directly, and you can also submit case information right through our website on the Contact Us tab. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I wanted to tell everybody, a lot of my attorneys who've reached out to me say that your pain and your suffering reports are excellent. So if
Thank
anybody's
you.
watching who would like a copy of that, please contact Kim. Like you said, they do medical chronologies, all sorts of wonderful things over there. And she's such a great resource. So if you can, Kim, write your information in the chat box for everybody. And then I hope that they will contact you. If not, if not now, definitely later on, because again, you guys are top notch and we love working with you guys.
Thank you, Ginger.
Thanks, Kim.
Thanks.
We'll see you soon. And
Bye-bye.
I'm gonna go ahead and hand it back over to Kyle and Randy. And thank you again so much for everything.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Ginger.
Thanks.
All right, Randy, it's all you, man. I'll let you pick up where you left off.
Are you seeing? Oh, hold on. You seen that full size, Kyle?
Yep, that looks great. Thanks, Randy.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to try and get through this rather quickly. I don't have a lot of time left. So here we have the acute lesions. Oh, it's not moving for me. All right, compared to the literature, again, here are dilated perivascular spaces, another finding common following carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, here we have left hippocampal atrophy, and what you're looking at is the dilated perivascular spaces on the right side of the image is actually the left side of the brain. If you think about it laying down with your head, your feet outward, your head towards the bottom of your feet looking up, that's why it's on the opposite side. So this shows that the hippocampal on the right side of the image, left side of the brain, is actually smaller than the one on the other side. So it has shrunk. Common finding following carbon monoxide poisoning. Here's the same thing compared to a normal. You don't have that white space. And then the literature supporting that. Now, some of the images, in fact, most of those images that I showed you were done in the clinical setting, meaning his doctor just referred him for an MRI. They got it done. And I was able to look at it and say, wait a minute, that's not right, that's not right, and that's not right. So then I send the clinical scan. Make sure you get a disc as soon as you know that your client had an MRI, get it on a disc. And then you may be able to see the abnormalities yourself and then send it to a neuroradiologist for a forensic opinion. And then obviously the clinician for the clinical correlation of that forensic opinion. But if you don't decide to get advanced neuroimaging, here's what you're looking for. SWI, DTI, volumetrics, perfusion MRI, and MRS. And these are used in TBI cases and CO brain damage cases. SWI may show multiple lesions, and those are the arrows pointing to the lesions. You can see them here. DTI, just like in TBI cases, you're looking for decreased FA values, and essentially, so a DTI reads tracts of axons. You're reading a bundle of them. You're not reading one. It's not that sensitive, but like 48 or 50 bundles of those axons. And here you can see that this particular bundle was over two standard deviations low. This particular bundle was over 2 standard deviations, and this is on one side. Obviously, this is on one side, but those bundles were not dispersing water the way they should have been. That's all it is. And here it is looking at the study, the Kim study that had normals, and your clients are 2 standard deviations below the normals. Then the pretty pictures, the fiber tracking, tractography, they can create these images that make it very apparent that there is a bundle missing. There are bundles missing here, bundles of axons. In fact, a bundle is probably going to be hundreds of axons, and when you see blank space like this, you're talking about hundreds of thousands. Again, just another image showing the same thing. This is the normal. These are the missing bundles. Okay, next thing is in advanced neuroimaging is volumetrics. That was DTI, this is volumetrics. And I'm only familiar with NeuroQuant as far as volumetrics. I know there are other companies doing this, but what they're doing is they're basically, they're using the imaging to develop volumes of different areas of the brain. And based upon that, they compare it to their normals. They have a normal database, and they'll tell you whether or not you have hippocampal atrophy or parts of the brain. And then, assuming you do, your expert neuroradiologist can look at the scans again and find out, oh, wait a minute, yeah, that does show hippocampal atrophy. And so that's consistent with the volumetrics. And in this case, this was the flower case again, flower shop case. So while the volumes were still in the normal range, the volumes on the left and the right, they were still in the normal range, but look at that asymmetry index. That doesn't happen unless there's some type of trauma, and in this case, CO. So it's important not just to look to the volume, but the asymmetry index. And then compare it to the regular films, and you should be able to identify the abnormality. All right, perfusion MRI or PWI, it's measuring the dispersion of blood flow. And in this case, here we have a normal, and this coincides with those diffuse white matter ischemic changes. In fact, boy, you put those side by side and it's pretty persuasive. The blood is just not flowing there. There were diffuse frontal changes that I showed earlier, that this is what it should look like. And then finally, MRS, and this is a cool advanced neuroimaging technique, but it's actually been around for a long time. It's been around to detect brain damage from stroke for 20 years. It identifies dead brain tissue, and it's taking readings from 20 parts of the brain. Each of these boxes is a reading, and it's measuring different chemicals and if they're ascending the way they should be. So each box contains a reading of chemicals. And here's what it looks like. So this box coincided with number 1, right? And 1 through 20. And what you're looking at is you're looking at this angle. So it's, I think I should have it on the next slide. Yeah, okay, so it's NAA, creatine, and choline, and this angle should be 45 degrees. Well, that's a normal, that's 45 degrees, but look at this. That is nowhere near 45 degrees. So that represents those chemicals that are not being processed the way they should by brain, which reflects dead brain tissue and is evidence of it. And again, because it's used with stroke patients to identify dead brain tissue, I've never had it challenged as far as Dauber. I'm just going to fly through this because this is done in all TBI, at least all of my TBI cases. You're looking for vestibular disorders, sleep issues, very common. The polysomnogram, again, it's objective evidence. It can't be faked. It's measuring brain activity, brain waves, leg movements, body movements, breathing. And you can screen for it with an at-home monitor that's really cheap. I think you can get these for 300 bucks. You can send one to your client and you'll get a doctor that actually interprets it. If there's anything there, you can get more workup done. Okay, I've been through that. Oh, that was the sleep patterns. That's a little, I don't have enough time to get into the details of that, but again, objective test of vision disturbance, very common following CO, just like brain damage. The eyes are not tracking the way they should be. And this is a cool test, a cool objective test for diagnosing brain damage neurooptometrically. So this is the VEP test. And this guy is taking the VEP. There's an electrode back there. There's an electrode on his forehead. And he's looking at this checkerboard that will then reverse colors. So it'll go from black box to white box and vice versa. All right, so when that happens, your eye senses that, right? And passes it on to your brain. Well, the VEP, those electrodes measure how long it takes from the eye to get to the back of the brain where our brain processes vision. And that there's a normal. So it goes from the eye back to where the occipital lobe where it's processing that signal. And that's going to give you a readout as to whether or not your client falls into that normal range. And I don't know how they'd argue that that is not an objective test and that can't be faked. I'm sure they'll come up with something, but I haven't heard that yet. And that's example of double vision. This is a very simple red lens test where the red and the white should, the red and the white should be together. The patient puts the red over one eye, the doctor holds it out there, and the white and red should line up horizontally and vertically. And if they don't, your client is probably a candidate for prism glasses that correct that mistake that your brain is making. And sometimes I've had clients with these represent nausea, anxiety, headache, neck pain, unsteadiness with walking, and light sensitivity. And the improvements, the orange is before the prism glasses, the gray is after wearing the prism glasses. And it's hard to argue that your client is faking if they have that much improvement, right? Finally, SLP and neuropsych deficits, we know what those are from our TBI cases. And to wrap it all up, when your clinician expert is talking about his or her differential diagnosis, if you've developed your case properly, there is no dispute that there was CO poisoning and brain damage because of it. You've developed the neuroimaging, the vestibular, the sleep, the vision disorder, the auditory processing, impaired language and memory, and then the neuropsychological deficits. There is no other differential unless they had some other diagnoses that made sense, but you're not going to find that. So, all right, that is the conclusion of my talk. I'm happy to answer questions.
Good deal. Thank you, Reddy. Yeah, I do have a question. So I've got a question here. Could carbon monoxide damage show up as unidentified bright objects on the brain?
Well, I don't believe in unidentified bright objects in the brain. That may be what the clinician said, but if you see unidentified bright objects in the brain and it shows up on two different, so we have the axial, we have three different views of the brain in a typical MRI. And if it shows up on more than one, it's not unidentified, it's identified. It's not artifact. It's not going to be there on more than one plane of the imaging. Okay, so we know it's something. And yes, those bright spots are likely ischemic lesions.
Got it. Thank you.
So what you need is someone to look at the scan who knows what to look for.
Like a neuroradiologist?
Yeah, or you may be able to do it yourself. Once you know where that white spot is, you can look at a different slide and see if it's on the other slide in the same location. It's not that complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then the neuroradiologist could actually, I mean, obviously I can't give you an opinion, but I can tell you whether it makes sure to send it to it makes sense to send it to the neuroradiologist.
Well, I guess one of the other questions was, timing. Do you ever see cases where somebody was poisoned, they were treated, and a certain amount of time goes by? Does time in these cases become an issue if somebody doesn't come to you for a year after a particular event happens, as opposed to right when, something occurred?
Well, yeah, these cases are a little different than TBI cases because we have the delayed neuropsychological sequelae that happen in CO cases, whereas usually in our TBI cases, if our clients are still symptomatic at 6 months, they may be permanently symptomatic, but in these cases, it can develop over time, unlike the TBI cases. So I certainly wouldn't try and resolve a CO case under a year unless my client was completely symptom-free. But again, those six things that I identified to develop your case, those problems can all be treated. So they may show improvement, and that's why you have a life care plan. Identify what's going to help them and get them back to as close as possible, possibly 100% as possible. And that requires expensive treatment, right, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, look, it ties in, exactly to what we do. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head when we first started talking. How we came together was really out of the life care plan. Hey, I've got this life care plan for somebody who has been injured, but they've got all of these deficits. But they haven't had any of the treatment to prove up the life care plan. And so, I think that's where our company at HMR steps in to really, it proves the life care plan. It prevents the argument from somebody saying, well, I see that you've got a $10 million life care plan here, but show me what they've actually done up to this point. Why should we believe that they're actually going to have this treatment in the future? And so, I think utilizing a resource like ours, especially when you're talking about brain injury and trying to find some of these specialists like neuropsychologists and, neuro-ophthalmologists and, companies that can provide prism glasses or, everything in between, it really, changes the dynamic on these cases. And I think what's great about having been working with you has been, hey, you're located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but you've got, cases where you represent people all over the country. And so, our company comes in as maybe that conduit, to help somebody who might be representing, a client in Florida, but you're in Milwaukee, so that is something that we do very well across the country. It just so happens to be highlighted in the cases that we've done with you. So we always enjoy the opportunity to work with you, but it's how we've connected with so many of the audience members on Connectionology throughout this past year. And obviously the fact that we do it all non-recourse, is an added benefit. We try to do our due diligence at HMR just like a law firm would, understanding that timeliness is an issue though. You've got to be able to get people into the treatment they need when they need it. It can't take an exorbitant amount of time. So we've been fortunate that we can execute on that level, especially on traumatic brain injury cases. Okay, Ginger, before we go, I think we've knocked out all the questions, but I did get the winner of the coffee giveaway today, so I was going to give you the winner.
Fabulous. The winner is going to get 4 bags of this. They're so big, I can't even hold all 4 up, but 4 bags of this freshly roasted coffee. It smells so good, but this will last you a while. And I'm excited to see who the winner is too.
Deal. Today's winner is Lloyd Nolan out of Chesterfield, Missouri. So congratulations, Lloyd.
Yay, congratulations.
Ted will be getting with you shortly to make sure that we get everything either shipped to your office or your house. And as always, we appreciate you supporting Connectionology and participating in the webinars.
Fabulous. Well, congratulations to Lloyd. I'm actually very happy to hear that he won because he was in Santa Fe with us just a few weeks ago. Great attorney, and I know that he watches a lot of these webinars. So thank you, Lloyd, if you're still with us. And Ted and I will reach out to you after this webinar. But don't worry, because if you didn't win today, there's still a chance to win tomorrow because we have one more webinar and you don't want to miss it. Just go to connectionology.com so you can sign up. But I just want to thank you, Randy. Thank you so much for doing this webinar because it's so important to highlight special cases like these. And for everybody who's watching, I'm going to email you their contact information in just a few minutes. But please, feel free to jot down the email address and the phone number for Randy and for Kyle, and also for Kim. Again, does an amazing job over there at On Point. We're so grateful for all of you guys.
Awesome.
And with that, do you guys have any closing comments?
No, I'm happy to share my materials too if anyone wants it. And thank you again, Ginger. Thank John for me. Kyle, always good to see you.
You too, buddy.
All right.
Thank you so much for putting everything on.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you have a great day, and I hope we see you again tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Take care.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.